Hi, this is Emmet. Just a quick heads up before we dive into our next episode today. Myself and Mikael are recording a live session of the Handstandcast on Tuesday, the 5th of May on Zoom. The live recording will be accessible to anyone training our HandstandFactory online programs and will fit the first 100 people to join the session. The link will be posted in our private subreddit for all HandstandFactory students. So if you're training one of our programs, be sure to join the forum until then. For those of you that just enjoy the podcast, don't worry, the live episode will air as usual on the Thursday following the recording. So hopefully see you on the forum soon. And now, just enjoy today's minisode. Welcome back to the Handstandcast from HandstandFactory, a podcast based on talking about all things hand balance with me, Emmet Lewis, and my co-host,
Mikael Christiansen.
We are here, basically, we have our courses on HandstandFactory, we have our YouTube videos, we have everything else. And we just kind of like to talk a bit more because there's so much more in-depth information we can hopefully give you guys.
We also like to ramble, so...
Yeah, we like to ramble. Anyone who's met us in person know we like to ramble a lot. So anyway, this episode is called #TuckLife.
Tuck Life.
And we're going to talk about everything with the tuck handstand. We're going to talk about shoulder flexibility or mobility, what actually is a tuck handstand, the 3 different types of tuck handstand, what is #TuckLife, tuck so you don't suck. I think
all
there's
that garbage.
Yeah, a lot of garbage, but a lot of noble garbage maybe. First things first, I suppose, Mikael, how would you define a tuck handstand?
Tuck handstand, I guess, is... the entire term of tucking is like the same as in a back tuck, in a back flip, where you pull your knees towards your chest in some way or other. And a tuck handstand then is obviously when you do a handstand and you pull the knees in front of the body and you bend the legs. So there are a bunch of different ways that this can be done that we'll discuss, but essentially that is kind of the main terms.
What I'd call as a tuck, or the tuck family, is everyone has an idea of that it has to look like this. This is the problem. It has to look like this. But for me, a tuck handstand is a handstand that has flexion at the hips and flexion at the knees. That's it. And your feet can do whatever you want. And the shoulders and the back can be in different configurations, which we'll talk about. But that basically covers a tuck handstand. It covers everything from a small sort of mini tuck, like a plie, I suppose, all the way down to bringing your knees to your chest and, everything in between. So, I suppose, first things first.
I guess like the basic, like tucks have kind of like taken off a lot in terms of popularity, and for good reason. They are kind of a very basic skill to learn as you develop your handstand. Not only because it's it does a bunch of different significant things, but I guess first of all, it's because it's rather accessible early on in the process when you're learning.
There's no high flexibility demands, I suppose.
No, exactly. It's very like, if as soon as you can handstand to a reasonable degree, you probably have the control to be able to tuck your legs to some degree or other. And once you do have that it gives you a bunch of options, not only on like the actual tuck handstand, it'll give you over time the ability to jump through a tuck, which some people find to be the most comfortable way to enter handstand anyway from the get-go. This depends a bit on the person. Yeah. But it teaches your body about underbalance, and that is maybe the largest reason for it being a significant stepping stone for learning handstands.
It's definitely I suppose with the tuck, one of the things I like when I'm teaching people tuck, or particularly when they're learning to free balance it kind of changes the configuration of the body from a pole to a lollipop. And if you think about what's going on here, have you ever tried to balance a stick on your fingertip, on your nose, on your face? You don't get a lot of feedback. Or if you try a broomstick or something with a weight at the end, you have more feedback basically coming from the object. And you get the same effect in a tuck. It's quite common when people are learning that it's harder to balance in terms of raw strength, but the reactions get a bit better. I've noticed this a few times. It's like, okay, they can, because you have just more concentrated mass going one way, and there's less particularly when the tuck is locked into shape, there's less things that can move. So then the balance just becomes less of a problem to solve for people. So they're quite good that way. It's quite a...
Yeah, they also like you lower the center of mass quite a lot when you pull the legs down. But what it also does is that it challenges your body in like basically what's happening is that like you take this straight object or however straight you're able to make your body, and then you move the knees in front of the body. And what that does is that it starts changing the biomechanics of what's going on quite a lot. Because if you just stand on your hands and then you pull your knees in front of your body and you do nothing, you do no compensation for the fact that this movement is happening, you will fall 100 out of 100 times. In the same way as if you stand on your feet and you just suddenly pike at the hips and put your head far front, and if you don't adjust by putting your butt backwards, you fall forwards. Like, it's not a discussion, it's just simple physics. So this, like, learning to tuck then will force your shoulders to be working in a specific way, because like the legs start moving downwards in front of your body, and the shoulders need to solve this somehow. And the kind of optimal way that we are looking at doing this is by, as the leg go in front of the body, you keep the flexion of the shoulders, and you keep pushing through the shoulders so that you're keeping the alignment as similar to a straight handstand as possible. But what will happen is that your hip will move slightly further over your fingertips to accommodate for the fact that your knees are in front of you. However, what we're looking for is to keep this straight line from hand through the shoulder and through the hip. So it'll go from kind of like straight line upwards to a slightly diagonal line if you would basically trace a marker from like the hand and up to where the tailbone is kind of.
I think that straight line cue confuses some people as well, because they imagine the straight line must be a vertical line when it's still a straight line. It's just at an angle of maybe 15, 20, 30 degrees. Yeah. And the pivot point becomes basically, it pivots around the main center of pressure in the hand. So what you will see, the tendency, particularly when people are learning, particularly if they're a bit more flexible, I think we get this Mexican kind of arch back tuck where the shoulders stay vertical. But then something has to go and say, even if they're flexible enough in the back to keep the ribs vertical, then the lower back arches and sticks the butt out, and you get this kind of twerk effect, I suppose. Yeah. And that's kind of, it's okay, but it's almost like it takes the demand out of the upper back.
Yeah, that's a thing with it, that like if you do this type of tuck, what has a tendency to happen, like since like the ideal version where you kind of, or ideal is also strange to say, like there's the continuum.
Our perceived version of ideal.
There is a continuum here, but like muscularly what you want to achieve with this quote unquote proper tuck is that you want your upper back to be challenged slightly more when the legs are pulled deep in front of you, and then like this becomes harder and harder the deeper down the legs go towards the floor, because that will start training your pressing strength on an early level. And if you're able to achieve this, you will be starting to develop this kind of shoulder flexion strength that you will need both for like strengthening your general alignment, for working on pressing and leg movements and controlling underbalance. So while this kind of more arched version of the tuck happens when instead of the shoulders being allowed to go slightly further towards the fingers as you tuck, not a lot, of course, you still keep this line from hand to hip, that should be straight. But if you move it in the other direction, so you move the shoulders kind of behind the hands almost, that has a tendency to kind of, then you will be able to tuck your knees just fine. It's just that you will be kind of counterbalancing the fact that your legs go.
Yeah, it's like a seesaw. Yeah. Now, don't get us wrong, we're not saying there's one right or wrong. This one, what Mikael is describing, it's when you're beginning to go into the Mexican-shaped tuck. Mexican, our definition would be a handstand with a very arched back. What you're trying to do is you're trying to push the chest all the way towards the heel of hand, so it goes outside that line, so it's not vertically above it. And then that allows the hips to come down further and further into counterbalance. We have this lovely tuck shape that can be quite accessible quite early on.
If you have a flexible kind of upper back, like you're your thoracic spine is flexible, that this is what your body will tend to do as you try to tuck. And it's fine to do, but it's important to know why it happens and why you want to do the various versions, because this type of tuck, it's interesting. Like, I had a student once, she was a contortionist, extremely flexible, and her tuck handstands would always be like that. She would literally shoot out the chest to be able to tuck the legs, and she could go very, very deep, very far down with the legs, even in a pike in the same manner.
Yeah.
But she would always have to keep this kind of chest out position, and she couldn't press. And I found that very fascinating, because if you now compare these two tuck versions, the one that where you pull the chest towards the heel of the palm, like, you will not be getting heavy work done on kind of your upper back and the mid trapezius and the upper trapezius and so on, while the quote unquote proper tuck, where you keep a straight line from hand to hip and you allow the shoulders to go slightly over the hands, you'll be actually be building that trapezius strength that will give you access to keep that rounded back shape as you go in the low parts of the press.
Yeah, it's also this, the active shoulder flexion strength is one of the key components to developing the overhead mobility for the handstand.
Exactly.
As well as more advanced skills, as well as transfers to bridge too. And it's one of these things that's like, in the push program, we have some of these tuck wall slides. I'm saying keep pushing for this exact reason, that we have them in the templates where we know people will be a bit tighter in the upper body. And this is the counterbalance to the flexibility work, where we're directly challenging the shoulders to flex. So if we imagine in flexibility training, we have two sides of the joint. We have one side which gets lengthened, and one side that gets shortened. And this kind of strength is what allows the body, the chest, the lats to open and release, that we're building a lot of strength to, where we're basically actively pulling ourselves into the alignment we want.
Exactly. So I think that is also one of the reasons why the tuck is actually a good thing to work on a reasonably early level, because you are putting you're putting extra stress on the shoulder flexion. So you put weight outside of the center line. Your body has to force the shoulders to keep this alignment from hand to hip, and it strengthens the traps quite a lot. And the interesting thing here is that you'll find people that just find, for example, the tuck wall slides, which is basically my favorite exercise in the world. Like, you'll find people that just you ask them to do it and they do 10 reps, like knees to chest, and it's all perfect. And they're like, but what was the point of this? And they just have the shoulder mobility needed. Like, there is no real challenge for them. But then you take someone who has rather tight shoulders here, and it'll absolutely murder their backs. Usually like the mid trapezius, even like the low backs sometimes, like, they'll be completely challenged just by doing a few reps, and they feel like their shoulders and backs are dying. So it's quite common, and it's often an easy like assessment tool I use. Also in terms of like the templates that we made in push, just like this kind of, if you're strong and maybe you lack mobility, or the opposite, you can rather easily see this just like by simply testing like where the ability of doing wall supported tuck slides, as we call them.
Yeah, it's tuck. It gives a lot. It's one of those handstands like straddle. A lot of people can access straddle, and I don't find straddle gives a lot.
No, it doesn't really.
It's a cool handstand. Pike gives a lot, but you have to.
It's too hard. Yeah,
it's too hard for a tuck. It's just like,
it's just there.
Every level of handstand can find a tuck variation that will transfer over.
Yeah,
I suppose that leads us into the closed tuck.
Yeah, that's also an interesting one, because like now we just spoke about like there's a term I've said 2 times now, and that is that the shoulder needs to slightly go past or like forwards over the hand as we do this. And it's very important to mention that like this is not by breaking the shoulder line. So if we do the closed tuck, where like you will literally be moving the shoulders forwards on purpose, this is what you would do if you would lower a tuck handstand into a tuck planche. You'd be doing this.
Yeah.
Like be literally allowing the shoulders on purpose to shift forwards, and you would see like even as the movement starts, you would see an angle starting to happen between the upper arm and the upper back. And this one is one that like often will happen to people as they learn, especially people who have tight shoulders that are trying to do tuck jumps.
Or if they're just pretty strong in the chest and
yeah, exactly.
Else they get this whole like shoulders go forward. There's this don't know, obtuse angle at the shoulders rather than like the continuous curve.
Yeah.
But there's still that type of like, if we just to define things for people who aren't too certain what we mean by open and closed tuck. When we talk about an open tuck, for me, it's when the femurs and the pelvis are at 90 degrees or above. That's an open tuck. A closed tuck is when the knees go below 90 degrees. So if you imagine if you completely straighten your handstand, this would mean femurs parallel to the floor. Going below that and aiming to get the thighs to the chest or the stomach would be a closed tuck. So,
just to clarify now, because now we were talking about closing actually in two
closing
different
the shoulder,
manners here. I started talking about the closed shoulders because I assumed that was what you were talking about. But yeah, the closing of the angle of the legs will be relevant to how deep you go in the tuck, of course. So the open one will like not go too far down. And you will also not see as much shoulder angle forwards, not as much lean necessary as you do one that is open versus one that is closed, kind of.
Yeah. It's also, there's one of those ones like there's some really nice extreme closed tucks. I remember you had me doing this a few years ago when we met in Berlin. Like chin on chest tuck handstand. So that's tucking your chin so you're looking upwards, then trying to touch your knees to your chin. I think
it's a funny one.
Got it once and then it hurt a lot.
Yeah, that's where you like. It's actually interesting when you do the head in tucks. Like this is kind of more on kind of the advanced levels of tuck handstands.
We can cover it anyway.
Yeah. Like what's interesting there is that those are very hard to do if your shoulder angle or if the shoulders start to angle as you go into the tuck. So let's say you start pulling your legs down and then. If your shoulders need to move a lot forwards, it'll be very hard to put your head through there. So it's kind of a good test of how developed your tuck is. And of course, there's another like coordinative level because you need to be able to control both your legs and actually be able to change your head positioning as you do so. So, like. As we were talking about here, like the tuck basically has like a lot of different applications in its in the way it functions and in the type of options it gives you, and also it kind of functions as a conditioning tool or a kind of way to help you build up like the strength you need to be able to pull the joint into the kind of position that you actually want to be holding your handstand in. So it's a very fascinating position, and it kind of leads me to just think about like the term tuck life. It has kind of a funny backstory to it. Now that is kind of a meme, but
Mikael is the handstand meme machine. Hashtag tough life. Hashtag suffer.
So what happened with that one was that I was in circus. I was teaching in circus school in Copenhagen, and a friend of mine, a Norwegian guy. Eivind, if you're listening, we were doing like finishing handstand class, and he has a handstand, but he has a tendency to bend his arms, and I'm like, okay guys, so just finish up with like stomach to wall. You do like total of 20 or whatever it was tuck slides, and he just like hunches his back and goes towards the wall, like, oh, tuck life. And yeah, that's basically where it started. I just fucking died, and from that it kind of just became a thing of the tuck life part of the class, and lo and behold, internet. So that is essentially the
that's the
backstory of the meme. But it is like I said, very much of a useful position to start with. And I mean, you won't be like, to say it like this, you won't be able to move very far into advanced hand balancing vocabulary, meaning like past what a normal 2-arm handstand is, unless you have like a substantial degree of control of it, I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely one of these positions that is essential. Other ones are debatable, but I know people who are advanced 1-arms and their 2-arm pike non-existent essentially, whereas tucks are always going to be pretty good.
Yeah, they'll kind of always be present there. There's like an interesting. What was I gonna say? I completely lost my train of thought.
It's okay. I like just for those people who are still listening. There's one program based on the tuck life story that I like to give to people at once you reach the stage where like you can hold the tuck for 15-20 seconds. I generally give people this as a 6-week phase of you have to do 3 minutes of tuck handstands as conditioning at the end of your handstand training. Now, normally I would reduce the number of sets in the training just to accommodate for this. But by the time people go through this process and have just done this conditioning to the upper back, it's like the change in handstand you will see. The alignment, the shoulders, everything works very well. It's difficult. There's going to be a lot of DOMs, but it's one of those ones like aiming to get like, once you can balance, aiming for 30, 40-second tuck handstands is challenging but rewarding.
Yeah, it's just super useful in general to just like you just need to make sure that like this is part of your training at some point or other. Of course, when you have it, it's not really a big deal anymore. And that's also one of the things I find very fascinating, that it can feel super duper heavy until the point where you are strong enough and where your body has kind of accepted this type of shoulder position, and suddenly like doing a tuck handstand and doing a straight handstand is like more or less exactly the same. It's not like physically heavier to do a tuck handstand once you kind of like you really have access to it, but it does take some time for some people, and it's really important to know that like there are just certain people that will have to work their asses off to get a tuck, while you will have some that will literally be able to do their first hold ever will be the tuck because of the lower center of mass.
Years ago in circle media when I was learning handstand was pretty shit at the time. Tuck handstand was the one where I first broke. 30 seconds, a minute, 45 seconds. All this is just a shape that came very easy for me. So you'll get that quite easy. Lisa, one of our producers, our main producer, she's the tuck queen. Seb as well, who trains with me, is pretty good at tuck. So it's definitely one of those things where you can see, don't limit yourself to the straight shape.
Yeah, and like it's also like for many people, like if you compare it to the straddle, for example, the straddle is one that also will be one of the earlier shapes to learn, but the variance between people, like the variance of like how much they can actually open their legs, will be so drastic that you can have someone with just like 180-degree split from day one, and then someone who gets like their legs less than a meter apart, and then it kind of means that it'll be a very large difference of experience for these two people, while the tuck will just like on average be more of a it'll be more consistent kind of in terms of learning process if you compare people. And
especially if you have people who are like, okay, this person has tight shoulders, this person has tight shoulders, this person has a good straddle, this one doesn't have a good straddle, but their tuck handstands will probably get good at the same rate, give or take a bit. It's quite a
and also just simply because like most people, if you can pull your knees to your chest, like lying on your back, you likely have like at least the passive mobility to just your legs can be in that position, while a wide straddle for someone who isn't flexible enough, like their bodies are incapable at that point in time to be in that position. So that is like one of the reasons why I really enjoy to teach the tuck early, and also it's one of the like tuck is kind of one that will, let's say someone who's rather early on learning handstand and they've started to stand on their hands, and they've mainly been challenging, or they've mainly been challenging the overbalance, like controlling from the fingers and so on.
If you listen to our episode on the handstand, we talk about beginners. Your first battle when you're learning a handstand is controlling overbalance, but then the rest of your handstand training is the fight against underbalance.
Exactly. So because once you're really good at your like it's particularly interesting to see from my practice now after all these years, like for one arms and so on, my placement is such that I will never drop over the finger side of things on one arm. Like it very rarely happens unless I do like a significant mistake of some sort. What will happen is if I drop from whatever handstand it is, it'll be because my shoulder sinks, because of whatever kind of destabilization happens, but it'll essentially drop me towards underbalance constantly. That is kind of the direction of falling, and because it just becomes so that like your placement in the hand is no longer so much over the fingers, and it'll be kind of the same for a beginner, that like if you as a beginner you can start to stand a bit in straight, like if you are then conditioning and learning the placement of the tuck then with a wall and so on, like what will slowly but surely happen is that like when that person, like they're able to stand for a while and then their weight moves too far into underbalance, like you have then over time been building up this capacity of the body. Like you've given your body some strength and some experience there, which means that like the body will be able to react when it arrives into those positions. And that doesn't even need to be that your legs tuck. It might be that like you're almost in a handstand, or like you're in a handstand and then your shoulders sink a little bit, which means that your feet start like either piking a bit or like the legs separate a bit or something, but the weight moves towards the heel of your palm. And then you're suddenly able to react there because like your body has been given some experience in this situation. And I think that is a very important thing to consider with the tuck, that you just you give access to a new zone of control early, even though like you're not really experiencing like I've usually seen when I teach people, especially online, that like it takes a few months where they're mainly messing around in overbalance and like, okay, they kind of get 30 seconds and so on, and suddenly you start seeing these kind of like these larger kind of wobbles towards underbalance, but they catch them.
But it's like
takes some
that
time.
shoulder flexion strength just kicks in through the heel of the palm.
Exactly.
I see the exact same thing. It's very interesting when you look at developing balance. It kind of develops in a series of stages, where it's probably a topic for another podcast, but it's kind of like this discrete things that happen when people like begin to develop the reactive capacity, and underbalance strength is definitely one of them, or resistive active shoulder flexion, where you resist and just refuse to come down into underbalance, and tuck gives that strength. So I'd like to move on a bit on how do we get into a tuck handstand. That's
so like basically so unless you have any capacity of carrying the weight in front of your body at all, like let's say that like your shoulders are either too tight or too weak or whatever it is to be able to get your knees anywhere low in front of your body, and that will cause you to crash forwards. This is very often the case. So if you wondered why you can't jump through a tuck to handstand, well, it's because your body does not have the capacity to jump through this range. It doesn't have the support, and what you'll feel is that you put your hands on the floor, you think you're going to jump to handstand, and maybe the teacher tells you this should be easy, but you feel you're going to fall on your face. Well, that is because like your body does not have the carrying capacity to bring you up through this range, because it'll have to resist the forwards force that will inevitably needed to bring your pelvis over your spine. So first of all, you need to make sure that like you can do that. That's why like we advocate the tuck wall slides, because like they're stomach to wall. They don't have a balance component. They're practically there to condition your shoulders, upper back, to strengthen it so that you can be able to use this in free space. And then like, of course, when you have some degree of ability to do this, you can also use back to the wall setups. And those are kind of detailed in terms of like how to actually get into it, so you don't sabotage your entrance.
They're kind of like, they're one of those ones where you can use them for getting into the Mexican tuck, the arch back tuck, and that's great. But if you are trying to get rid of that and keep the chest down and keep the ribs in, then it can become tricky. It can become very easy to lose where you are ups down unless you have a very familiar position to return to. The other thing is just to go from the other end is the straight handstand to tuck. And there's a couple of kind of ways to get it, what are kind of interesting. Is one, we can go kind of sequentially, where we go bend at the knees and then bend at the hips. So you kind of get this domino toppling effect.
It's kind of 1-2 bend.
Yeah. And that's probably the first way you'll get it. But the problem is, like, if you bend too far at the knees, then you have to hit the brakes or be careful not to shoot the chest out, or hit the brakes with the fingertips grabbing the ground. But you'll see this way happening a lot with people who are... There's a balance phase when you're learning the handstand where you're constantly keeping finger pressure down, where you're constantly slightly in overbalance. You see it a lot with a lot of strong people before they're found the actual precision point of the center point. So you'll see this a lot. They go knees down and then... knees bend, then hip bends. There's the other style where it's kind of... It's almost an idea that, like, for me, it feels like I try to push my knees horizontally. And then what happens is, because the knees are moving, the sensation is horizontal, but then the hip moves as well to bring them down.
Yeah.
So you get this idea of, I suppose the phrase from Tai Chi always comes relevant here, of like, one thing moves, all things move. One thing stops, all things stop. So you're basically aiming to arrive at the maximum degree of knee flexion and the maximum degree of hip flexion, whatever you've chosen for where you're going open, close, wherever, all at one time. So what happens there is because we have less things arriving, every time we have a joint moving and stopping, then we have to rebalance. Whereas if we can get both the hips and knees to arrive at our chosen point at the same time, we only have to actually correct the balance once when we put the brakes on. So it's kind of good to get that idea of like the transition. It's also this idea, you see it a lot when people are learning to move shapes, where they go and it's kind of like a staccato rhythm, or it's kind of segmented where they move a little stop, move a little stop, move a little stop. And this, every time you have a pause point in, you end up having to rebalance your handstand. Whereas if you just move in one decisive motion, it doesn't have to be fast. It's like riding a bike. Once you're in motion, you're in balance. And then once you stop, you have to recatch the balance somehow. It's the same with moving from straight to tuck or straight to straddle, that you're looking at this idea. So just bear that in mind whenever you're trying to move. It's better just to move and then deal with what happens at the tuck versus carefully and very controlledly.
Yeah, don't go too slow, basically. It's like a way to kill yourself. But at the same time, like it's not about rushing. It's about just making it a decision of a movement and then sticking to that decision rather than basically just like trying to move in slow motion, because it really doesn't help you much, and it makes you just hyper aware of every little single detail that's going on, and you're better off just like focusing on your balance. You go from A to B in one like kind of controlled fashion. And also like just in terms of, if we bring this like fully down on kind of like absolute beginner level, I would say that like tuck slides and similar kind of preparation work can be done very early. Like I use it almost like for almost anyone that is starting out, like kind of even as an assessment exercise, just to see, okay, what is the carrying capacity of the shoulder? Like can the shoulders neatly deal with this kind of placement where the knees come in front of the body? If no, okay, fair enough, then I know that this is something that they'll need to work on, both in terms of maybe passive shoulder mobility, but also just like the strengthening of this range. While also, of course, I've met loads of people who just like their tuck is perfect. Even their extremely deep tuck is 100% there, but they still can't, like, or they can get into the position with the wall without having any muscular issues, or like it's not difficult, but they still can't balance. Well, then the issues and the kind of the things the person needs to work on are there are other things that are more important, basically. So it's really such a versatile tool, and one that bridges the gap in so many situations. It helps out like for a complete beginner. It helps out for kind of more intermediate level practitioners that are learning to move their legs and so on. It definitely helps out when we start talking about press to handstand, because it's maybe the technically simplest way of doing a press down, like a negative press, because you just go into the tuck and then you keep pulling your knees towards your chest until until your feet touch the floor, rather than in a straddle. It feels more fiddly, because like the positioning you're in a normal straddle, when the legs are kind of a little bit above you, you'll first need to articulate kind of the hip joint, and it's easy to kind of fall. While going to tuck, you stay there for a while, then you just literally crunch the legs towards your chest as hard as you can, and you'll be able to kind of work on the way down until you will fall through and your feet lands on the floor. So it's kind of like
I think it's one of the ones I use a lot with people. It's just like you're doing the tuck press down, and then it just removes the variables involved in the straddle. Because if someone, even if they have a wide straddle, the first thing that happens when they try to learn to press is they bring the legs together and it becomes more piked, more like a pike shape, and suddenly you have a lot more mass to deal with. Whereas this one is just like, okay, pull your knees to your chest, knees to nipples is a cue I use a lot. And then it's kind of like what happens if you can keep this cue, and if they know how to push the shoulders, you get the spinal articulation right to begin with. It starts at the sacrum and goes up the lumbar to the thoracic spine, and then at a certain point the shoulders start to go forward. Whereas if we do straddle, you can get a lot of people who would the spine doesn't have to react. You get a lot of people who close the shoulder angle and planche forward before the spine is actually articulated. So it's quite nice in that way that we can very quickly groove the actual press itself. Get a lot of strength on that one. It's a nice one when I get a few people when they're having problems with the negatives, backtracking or forward tracking to the tuck. Train that until you see like, okay, spine and shoulders are cooperating, going like sacrum, lumbar, thoracic, shoulders. Once you see that, then put them back onto the straddle. You'll see a big change in the technique in the straddle press, or an ability to understand it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean it also neatly kind of it kind of relates to the pike handstand as well, since like a pike handstand is exactly the same as tuck, except you need to you straighten your legs. And what that does, of course, it'll challenge your hamstrings more, because there comes in the flexibility component that is relevant. But the main thing that happens is, of course, that more body mass is outside of your center line. And the thing with that, I'm not going to go too much into the pike now, but like the key thing that like make them similar is just that if you would look at this lean happening over the hands, with like the hand, shoulder, hip line still staying intact and staying straight, like that diagonal will be steeper in a pike than it'll be in a tuck. It's very simple to see. If you do a pike handstand and then you tuck it and then you go back and forth between this, you will see the kind of little shift in the angle of the arms. Or then if you are doing the kind of Mexican version of the tuck, you will then need to move your shoulders like further towards the heel of your palm to compensate for the weight. Or if you're doing this with a broken shoulder line, kind of like where the shoulders close too much, you will see like a larger degree of planching as the legs straighten, because like in handstand in practice, one motion equals two motions. Like if you move something and you do not compensate for the fact that something is moving, you will fall out. So if the hip is moving, if the legs are moving, etc., you will always need to kind of, it's a constant calculation happening.
Yeah.
You need to solve the other part of the equation constantly, and that's something that needs to happen intuitively. And like using the tuck and using and understanding why these things happen and how to kind of control with them is like instrumental. And like can be used on an early level, can be used on very advanced levels.
Yeah, it's definitely one of these ones I like to tuck actually for teaching the balance point in the hands and how to feel the center of pressure, particularly with the Mexican version, even if people aren't super duper flexible, because you can set up the tuck and then you can just go, okay, I want you to feel your fingertips and now push the chest out till you feel the weight come out of the fingertips, and then let the hips go, and that will start the back bending. But it teaches getting the chest out of the way and then the hips pulling down, because if you let the hips go before you move the chest or move the shoulders, you get a huge amount of weight into the fingertips, and it's an instant feedback that you've set up the Mexican in a way that it actually limits your depth. You can't go deeper than a certain point. It's a bit variable for everyone. Whereas if you get the chest out, you get the weight goes from where it is, in the center of the hand or slightly to the side of the thumb, and it goes towards the heel of the hand. Then you have set up in a way that your hips can just basically go all the way down to the level of either your tolerance of the bent position, or to your limit of your flexibility on that day. So it's quite interesting in that way. Whereas if you get the weight onto your toes, it's kind of like if you do a hip hinge. It's like you do a hip hinge and you don't push your hips back. There's a certain point where your toes have to start pushing harder and harder and harder to resist the body going forward. Whereas if you push the hips back, in this case the chest is the hips, I suppose, from the handstand.
And fingers are the toes.
Fingers are toes, hands are feet, elbows are knees, pecs are glutes, and want some could be a glutey girl. What is it? A booty girl. That's the one. So it's that idea of like it's very clear to feel this as well, and getting, particularly say when we come to Mexican training with people, I will generally have them train 2 exercises when they're first learning Mexican, once they have the capacity. One will be a wall supported Mexican, just hold for time, just to get used to actually finding how to go deep and take the balance out as we normally do. If people are familiar with our training method, we reduce variables to the minimum amount to tolerate and then increase the variables as you get better. So we take the balance variable out and then we get you used to going deep. But then the tuck Mexican, I do that to train people for learn how to do the freestanding weight shift into the heel of the hand.
Yeah, it's very useful.
So it's very useful because it's very clear. It comes to that weight to the fingers, you've got it wrong. Basically, weight out of the fingers, you've got it right. So it's very binary. It's very like, this is right, this is wrong. What else can we do in the tuck? I suppose we haven't really talked about using the tuck for jumping.
Jumping, yeah, that's one thing you can do with it. I mean, you're essentially like charging, like you're in a charged position, you kick from a tuck and you go up. if you have good luck through the shoulders. But then one other thing too that I was thinking that with, like, I was always fascinated about the tuck when I started circus because it's so much used in circus, but I'd never seen it before. And I'd like in gymnastics, like it's a position that is barely used at all. I mean, I guess there's certain mounts where you'd go through tuck, but it's not kind of a as
you'd use it a lot with kids
used.
when they're learning,
for sure. But I mean, like kind of competitively, like you'd never like on rings. There is no reason to tuck your handstand. Like on like just the tuck's handstand itself is not like a shape that is as kind of used in that. And I think that is like the tuck kind of points to one of the differences between kind of circus technique, hand balancing technique, handstands, and the gymnastic style, where like if you break the body line on average in many of the gymnastic exercises, you are losing points on it.
Yeah.
And kind of
unless you're losing as transition, like there is transitions where you would, particularly on like when we're training like level 4 and 5 guys, probably out of date on this one, but like press to tuck shoulder stand, then kick the legs to a handstand as an element on parallel bars.
Yeah, okay.
And stuff like that. And then
yeah, I'm sure it's
but it's like a dynamic content.
Yeah, but like the tuck is just like ubiquitous basically with circus and kind of tuck ups and just a hold of the tuck and so on, while it's just like not as kind of seen in kind of the gymnastics side of the actual holds. I mean,
yeah, you don't even really see it in acrobatic gymnastics a lot either.
No, not so much, but like I think they at least use it for the development of pike handstands, and like if you think about it and bring it into kind of the dimension of the kind of reactive capacities of dealing with underbalance, where like we mentioned previous in the episode, this kind of planching of the shoulders that you can do to compensate for the fact that your knees are moving in front of your body. You'd be using the same thing in a straight handstand, and that is kind of the reaction pattern that you would be using in gymnastics, for example on rings or on bars, you'd want to keep the body line neat and straight from the toes to the shoulders so that you don't lose points in form. So you'd perhaps like, and also gymnasts are taught so that they have a very strong planche, so they can use this kind of micro planching in the shoulders, which keeps the feet to shoulder line completely straight. And of course that is what you need to do on rings, because you can't really like balance much from the hand. Whereas in hand balancing, since your goal is not to do a handstand on rings or in a dynamic fashion as in gymnastics, and you want to do a one-arm handstand, you can't really trust this kind of balancing
one-arm planche to correct.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. You can't lean the shoulder directly forwards and correct it from there. You would rather keep the hand to hip line straight, and that is essentially what the tuck and later on the pike teaches you, so that you'd literally, and that you can see, like it's quite common and easy position, even like comparatively speaking, like a one-arm tuck handstand isn't a problem as long as the shoulder, the hand to hip line stays straight. But I dare you to try to do a tuck handstand with a dropped and forwards placed shoulder on one arm. It's possible, but it's not going to be very nice for your wrist. So it's just kind of it kind of to me is a symbol almost of this sort of different approaches that you'd be using in gymnastics style elements versus hand balancing style elements. And of course, take this with a grain of salt. It's not like it's always one or the other. These are just like tendencies that you can trace because of kind of the end goal of these two disciplines. Kind of.
I think we should go back and reinforce like no, there is only one way to do this. So just move on to before we finish up. What are some non-typical things we could do in tuck if we're looking to get? We've got the shape. We can do it. We can do a straight handstand. We can do other shapes. What other things can we play with that aren't really spoken about?
In terms of like the tuck
In
play?
terms of like, so I don't know. So we have this idea of tempo. It's like you can always, we could go in and out of the same speed, or we could challenge ourselves and go really damn slow. So it's like Buto dance almost, where it's like takes 30 seconds, 40 seconds, a minute to go from a straight handstand to a tuck, but never stop, just always keep moving gently. Or we could have this idea of like, can we get in really fast? I like to do this with my students. I give them two contrasting things. I want you to do the movement really fast, so you're aiming to get like 10 reps in 30 seconds, or really slow, where you're doing 1 rep in 30 seconds. This idea of like it expands your coordinative capacity upside down, because it begins to take one of the things I like about these kind of tempo constraints is it takes the idea of balancing the shape and doing the shape, and am I right or wrong? And because you put the brain power into thinking and controlling the speed, then the body, you get out of the way of the body and it does the balance, and it does the kind of work, because it should be drilled at this point.
Yeah, like I think speed in general is a very fascinating and kind of often overlooked component.
Yeah, no one really talks about it, but it's like, it's one of those things that like, yeah, you want to get good, you want to tuck so you don't suck, you do it fast. The other one I also like is just the concept of tension in the shape. Like, can you maximally flex the body so it's really solid, or can you relax and have a very flow, kind of soft feel to it? Now, it's one of these things like these internal dynamics. It's visibly, I could look at you use these two internal dynamics, and I mightn't be able to tell you what your internal dynamic is, but I'll be able to say, hold on, you've done something different in this set compared to the last set, and trying to get these incredibly strong for yourself and how you do it. It's what takes, I suppose, the shapes, because let's face it, everyone does the same shapes in hand balance. Everyone, once you're able to do them, basically looks the same.
Yeah.
But what makes it different is the kind of space between, and like, how do I make my straight to tuck or my straddle to tuck, whatever, look different to Mikael's? How do I make it look different to someone else's? And this is how
kind of movement quality.
Yeah,
thinking.
This is kind of, it gives you more to play with, and then even if you're not interested in performing, it's the idea of balance training is the more variety we can give to the body, the more stimulus it has to adapt, and the better it gets at balancing. So it's kind of like, if you're looking to take your balancing to the next level, it's like start thinking speed, slow, fast. How would I do this movement if I was a robot? How would I do this movement if I was a chicken? I know the thing sounds stupid, and it's like, trust me, it's completely subjective, and there's no objective criteria of how chicken your tuck handstand is. But using these ideas can have a huge impact on your training, just like what it goes about, not just in tuck, but everything really. So there's a lot to play with there. We have a lot of them in Keep Pushing. A lot of ideas are like, okay, we want you to do the shapes, but we've given you the tools, not all of them, but a lot of them to play with. It's like,
so like basically like essentially with a tuck, as with most of the other things, first you condition and you learn the shape, you learn how it functions without needing to worry about balance. Your body has some sort of map of what this thing is about. You learn to work it in balance. Of course, you use a wall setup at first, so that you can actually efficiently get into the position without like sabotaging yourself there. You have an idea of the position, then you learn to do the position in free space, and then that would likely in the beginning happen from straight handstand that moves into a tuck. And then you start learning how to, perhaps you'll move into it from a straddle, or perhaps you'll move into it from a tuck jump to handstand. Maybe you do a straddle jump and then tuck your legs, and so on and so on. So like the variation comes there as you kind of like begin to build your vocabulary. But like as with most things, it's usually you are better off just building that ability to understand like how it's supposed to function first, starting to apply it, get strong enough, start balancing it, and then start moving in it. So like it's basically the same thing as we speak about in push as well. First you learn to hold your body, then you learn to balance your body, and then you learn to move your body while being in balance. So just like, it's a very generalized thing, but it's kind of a little bit of a bringing it full circle there.
Yeah, so I think we're going to wrap it up there. I think that was almost everything you could say about the tuck.
Almost.
watch out for our next episode on the tuck. It's just next season. It's just all tuck handstand.
Basically, this episode just like repeated.
Yeah.
Until you're sick of it.
Other than that, thank you for tuning in. I've been Emmet Lewis, here with Mikael Christiansen. If you like us or want to follow more of what we're doing, you can find us at, find me anywhere under Emmet Lewis. You can find Mikael at Mikael Balancing on Instagram. You can find us on our courses at HandstandFactory.com if you want to learn the practical side of hand balance. They're pretty good by our standards. We made them, we have to say that. If you want to add questions for the podcast, there's a contact form on HandstandFactory.com. If you put your question in there or DM it to Handstand Factory on Instagram, we will add it to the mix and get to it at some point in one of our mini-sodes. Other than that, thank you for tuning in.